everyone. So as we are getting into summer and looking into fall, I'm hearing from a lot of parents and teachers all about IEPs, eligibility, services, all the things that kids are going to need as we go into this re-entry into the fall. And there's a lot of confusion when it comes to IEP or special education, eligibility, and a medical diagnosis. And these two worlds of the educational world and the medical world are so very far apart most of the time when it comes to what a child needs. So for those of you that don't know, I started out in this special needs community as a special needs sibling. My brother is 42 with Down syndrome, so I live in the special needs community my entire life, still today, figuring out all the things that need to happen to make sure that my brother is as independent as he can be and, really being a meaningful contributor to our community. That is a huge thing, right? And I became a special education teacher because I was determined to change the world from the inside of my classroom after watching my mom go through the navigation of the education system. That lasted a little while, but for the last 20 years, I've been working for you, parents, teachers, admins, therapists, independently helping you build IEPs that work, that make sense, that really come together in the real world. And if we're going to make something work in the real world, we have to look at the child as a whole person. And that includes medical needs and educational needs. But how we get services and how we really make things happen to make these two worlds come together, it has to be very strategic. So the purpose of an IEP is to prepare a child for further education, employment, and independent living. It is to really provide an appropriate education that meets a child's unique needs. Now, when you go and you get a medical diagnosis of, let's just say, ADHD, and the doctor who did the diagnosis gives you a report, and that last page of the report has like 17 things that are listed of what can be done to support a child who has ADHD, such as your child with these characteristics inside of the school system. When you give that report to the school, the team needs to consider the report, not follow the report, consider the report. Some schools consider it by looking at the report and going, thank you, kind of putting it down. Now, we don't want that to happen. We want schools to look at the report. We want them to read through the recommendations, and we want to have an open conversation about what supports that are listed on this page make sense to ensure that the child's receiving an appropriate education based on their unique needs, and combining the knowledge of the medical world into what is appropriate for the educational system to be doing to support a child in making progress. Now, making all this happen doesn't have to be extremely difficult. It just has to be strategic. That's actually what I love to teach inside of the Master IEP Coach Mentorship, is the strategy that you need to open the conversation, to get through these sticky topics and get on the same page to make sure the child is supported. Because if we're not meeting the child's unique needs, which most often does include those medical diagnoses in there. So if we're not meeting the unique needs, then we're not going to have an appropriate education. We're not going to have the progress that we need to see. And the child's not going to be prepared for further education, employment, independent living like they need to be. So we really need to lean into what is an education supposed to provide. And when we get that medical diagnosis, when we have those recommendations from the outside specialist, when we're looking at, and this is not just a doctor, okay, we're talking about that outside occupational therapist who has a ton of recommendations that you go and you see through your private insurance, and they have all these things, okay? So, your outside speech therapist, your outside BCBA, we're talking about taking this outside clinical-based information and translating it into the educational environment. So we have Carla says that my county is making my daughter start at her base school, which does not have an autism hub, before she can be considered for an appropriate school. It's very annoying. So basically, Carla, what you're talking about here is that the school is saying we need to try the least restrictive environment first before we can move the child into a more restrictive environment. Now, the only way to really get around that is to see, do you have data that's from, and you're saying start at base school. So we're saying, is your child kindergarten age, preschool age? And do we have any data from some past environments to show the type of supports that your child would need to ensure that their unique needs are being met and that the education is going to be appropriate? The other thing is, let's just say that you're going to go with this. You're like, okay, I agreed to it and I'm not up for the negotiation right now, but what do we do next? I want to make sure that we have a really strong timeline, Carla, on how is your team going to take data and when are they going to report it? So we don't go 3 months, 6 months, 9 months into the school year before everybody figures out that this environment didn't work. So 90 days is typically the starting point when I'm working with the family or a school and we're trying to agree on a placement, whether it's moving child to a place that has more supports or less supports, that has, you know, maybe an academic-based program versus an academic combination with life skills program. There's all different ways to, you know, really design a program to work. But if a team and a parent are not agreeing on a placement, let's at least get a really strong timeline on there to ensure that we're not going to lose a school year. You know, that's one of the most important things that we're going to be working on inside of the Master IEP Coach Mentorship, which, by the way, it starts on Monday. All right, so this is your last chance. This is your last chance to get in before we hit that back to school year hustle. And let's just face it, this is going to be one of the most stressful back to school year seasons that we've ever had. Told you guys, I've been doing this for almost 25 years. That's a lot of back to school seasons in the special education community. And never have I ever seen something happen like this. None of us have, right? So we've got a lot of decisions and a lot of things that need to be made, created to ensure that a child can access their education, whether it's going to be a digital learning, plan, or it's going to be on campus with, modified attendance days, or it's going to be on campus and we need to get some, different modifications to maybe, mask requirements or sitting all the time requirements or one classroom requirements. There's going to be a lot of different rules that are put in place that we're going to have to navigate together to ensure that a child gets an appropriate education. And this is on top of all the other things when it comes to what should you be asking for and how do we look at least restrictive environment, like Carla was just talking about, when we're under all of these new rules that are going to be happening. I actually just saw today that one state put out a release that said, basically, if a child is going to need, they used legal jargon, so let me just use kind of layman's terms here. If a child's going to need a ton of support and a ton of different services to get back to their baseline skill level that they were at before, that the placement for the child may need to be changed based on how much they've regressed. That they may just start changing placements without like a full placement consideration change. No, we can't let that happen. I will tell you right now that I believe that was one of the Carolinas that put that. I can't remember if it's north or south, but we've got Master IEP coaches that are there right now that I know are going to be right on top of. Show me the data. Let's make sure that this is appropriate. Let's meet the child's unique needs. Let's make sure that we are documenting what supports are being used, what research-based curriculum is being implemented before we make any significant changes above and beyond what is necessary to keep a child safe. Let's get all this documented. So I would love to have you guys come join me in the Master IEP Coach Mentorship. We have parents, teachers, admins, therapists, basically every role at the IEP table is inside of this mentorship that starts on Monday, because we're all focused inside of the mentorship to get every child an appropriate education and to do this collaboratively. We are not lawyers. We don't file due process. Some of you guys just went, but what if it's needed? We can talk through that in the Master IEP Coach Mentorship, but we actually want to work with you before you need due process. We work with schools and teams to make sure that due process can stay off the table as much as possible and not used as a threat. We are the idea bringers, solution finders, and team builders of special education teams. So we're going to be working through these tough situations and not letting go what should be happening anyway in special education. See, what's going to happen with this back to school season is there's going to be a lot of hype over what happened in the spring. There's going to be a lot of focus on everything that's been missed. Absolutely, we need to consider those things, but we cannot lose momentum getting back into the school year because we are worried about what was missed. We need to get started. We need to get going. Then we can look back and see where do we need to adjust due to what has happened in the past. So I don't want you to get stuck as we go back into school system and we're looking at medical needs, educational needs, clinical data that perhaps your child's receiving more therapies right now in the middle of all this virus crisis because school wasn't available, but your therapy center was open for more speech therapy, more OT, more behavior therapy. So maybe you have more data that needs to be considered. There's a lot of variety of what people have experienced during all of the shutdown and getting back into school to make sure that we have an appropriate education. So I want to encourage you guys to come join me over at masteripcoach.com. I want to encourage you that if you have data and information from a clinical standpoint, a medical doctor, an OT, a PT, a speech, a BCBA, that you really think about how are we going to translate this into an educational need to ensure that your child has equal access to their education as their same age peers, that they have an appropriate education that meets their unique needs to prepare them for further education, employment, independent living. And yes, it is possible to put all that together and to move the conversation forward to ensure your child's taken care of. All right, guys, until tomorrow, I'll talk to you soon.